Okay. Yeah, the recording will actually all be uploaded to a YouTube channel. And that'll be recent. That's still in the works. You can access the articles on the website as well. I guess I'll just start off, because you said there were some new people. I'll just briefly mention what's been going down. There have been 2 series. The first series was really all about the philosophical substrates of this radicalized movement. And it began with Marx, obviously, Karl Marx. And then there are these 2 people who saw the failing underpinnings of Marx like nobody else could. And their names were Antonio Gramsci and Gary Lukács. And what they did, and this is just a brief summary, is they shifted the domain of analysis of the Marxist faith, which concerned economics. And they shifted away from economics and class, and they shifted it away, and they instantiated it onto things like culture and identity. So you have this paradigm shift that began with the economic and class, which are 2 rigid categories. They're categories that involve science. You can't mess with them. It's not about interpretation. It's about hard data, right? Marxism doesn't work because it isn't science. It's Hegelian social alchemy BS. And so they saw this. They said, wow, Marxism isn't going to work because it isn't economics and it isn't science. It's something else special, right? But these guys were Marxists. Gary Lukács and Antonio Gramsci, some of the greatest Marxists who ever lived in terms of their breadth of knowledge. So what they did was they resurrected Marx from the grave, and they shifted the domain of analysis away from the economic and class, and they instantiated it onto culture and identity. What the tool that they use to do that is called critical theory, and that's what I'm an expert in, is critical theory, which is you could say a tool that the Frankfurt School uses to completely subvert and transcend society. And so what happened was these 2 individuals single-handedly responsible for this paradigm shift. Because this course here is all about language, one of the terms that you have to understand in order to move forward is critical theory, as it is neo-Marxism. So when you hear neo-Marxism, that's critical theory. When you hear critical theory, that's neo-Marxism. Neo-Marxism is still Marxism. It's all the horrible trash that Marxism is. The only difference is that the domain of analysis has been shifted. It's now called, you can call it identity Marxism, you can call it cultural Marxism, right? It's neo-Marxism. It's the Marxism that came after that paradigm shift, that was a result of that paradigm shift. That's critical theory. So anytime you hear the word critical, and this is important to master the linguistic word game that they play, you hear critical race theory, you hear critical gender studies, you hear critical fat studies, you hear critical queer theory, you hear critical feminist studies, you hear critical legal studies. I can go on and on. Anytime you hear the word critical, it's Marxism. End of story. Nobody needs to talk to you about it. You don't need to do any research. It's Marxism. The only difference is it's the Marxism that applies to culture and identity. It applies to something that's malleable and able to be molded and changed. You can't change economics. It's on paper. You can't change class. It's a static category. You can change all you want if the domain of analysis is identity and culture, because culture and identity are subjective. So they win the Marxist game. This paradigm shift sparked by these 2 giants of the Marxist faith won the game because they don't have to stand on the predictions like Marx had to do. They don't have to stand on their predictions because culture and identity are not fixed categories. They're completely malleable. So when you apply the Marxist faith to something that's completely malleable, you can get away with just about anything. And this malleability you can call all of the victim paradigms that you see. You see, oh, that you're fat. Oh, you're part of the victim status. Oh, you're disabled and you're black and you're trans and you're a Muslim, but you're also a woman and you're also disabled, right? All these victim categories is a result of this paradigm shift, and it works. Obviously, you don't want something like this to work because it's absolutely insane, and there's nothing good about this kind of philosophy. So that's what the first section was, the first series was talking about that whole historical process. And that's a real historical process. It's not something that's trivial or, something that you can just leave go of. You can look it up. Neo-Marxism is a real thing. Of course, it's going to take them a very long time to admit that neo-Marxism is just Marxism with the domain analysis shifted. Anyways, then we talked about Paulo Freire, who was the person who refortified the Marxist faith by attacking the institutions. And that's the best thing you can do if you're a raging, radical, fatalistic Marxist, is attack the means by which society produces itself, which is education. Education produces carpenters. Education produces nurses. Education produces doctors and bricklayers, and right. If you can attack the means by which society actually produces itself, you have solidified the Marxist faith into the Western culture. So that's why the whole series is called The Marxification of the Western Ethos. Paulo Freire attacked the American institutions of education by redefining literacy, and he's also the person who coined the term woke. He systematized the term woke with his spiritual mentor, Dom Helder Camara, who was an extremely violent communist, Maoist sympathizer, gulag apologist, crazy nut job. So that was that part. And then the last part of that series was about Marcuse. And Herbert Marcuse was the radical of the 60s who brought all of the radicals into the institutions themselves. So there's a famous question, and that question is, where did all the radicals of the 60s go? Right? Where did all the Black Panthers, where did all the radical liberation movement go, which were terrorist organizations, if I might add. The founders of the Black Panther, actual rapists and murderers. I mean, you can just look that up. But where did they go? Where did all these radical, crazy, fatalistic, zero-sum Marxists go? Herbert Marcuse is responsible for pushing all of these radicals, these actual rapists and murderers, into the universities. You now have, and the question that verbatim is, where did all the radicals of the 60s go? Paul Boole is the person who asked that question. He's a very famous scholar. And the answer that he gives is they didn't go to the religious cults, nor did they go to the uppity dump. They went to the classroom. So the reason why they went to the classroom, again, is because if you can attack the means by which society organically produces itself, you're able to win the entire game. And that's what's happened. Paulo Freire was the person who had the philosophy that perpetuated the university. Marcuse was the strong arm that brought all that was the first series. And I have to explain all this because there were some new people. The second part of the series, the second series, was about what results because of this ramification of this Marxist faith system. So after the institutions, what happens? You get everything from critical gender studies to critical queer dance theory to critical race theory. You get all of these different subjects, right? But they all lead back to one thing. They all lead back to one thing, and you could say it's Marxism. The technical, you would be correct in saying that it's neo-Marxism. It all leads back to critical theory. It all leads back to the Frankfurt School. All of it leads back to the Frankfurt School. And nobody questions this, not even the woke. So there's different levels. There's the woke who doesn't know what's going on because they don't understand really anything, but they've fallen for it. And then there are the woke who are actual scholars. And everything that I have been trying to teach is about leveling up to the scholars, you could say. But so we talked about critical race theory and critical gender studies. We talked about queer theory and things like that, right? It's all the same stuff. It's critical theory applied to these social particular domain of analysis, whether that be the color of your skin, whether that be your sexual identity, whether that be you're fat or not, whether or not that be you're disabled, right? All of these dictum, right, has the word critical in front of it. So it's all the same stuff if you trace back the origins. So what I'm going to say before I actually get onto this lecture is technically the last thing we spoke about prior to this course here was something called critical social justice, which is the engine that perpetuates all this trash into the universities. It's like the orb in the sky. And critical social justice ideology is critical theory. And again, what critical theory is, you have to remember, is neo-Marxism. End of story. That you can't let anybody tell you otherwise, and you have to write this stuff down. Critical theory is Marxism, so it's Marxism applied to culture and identity. That's what critical theory is. Critical social justice is critical theory applied to social justice, applied to the civil rights movement. So the civil rights ended in 1989, and Kimberly Crenshaw published a horrible book along with 30 who all admitted prior to this magical meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, that they're all Marxists. So the idea that critical race theory isn't Marxist, the idea that critical gender study isn't Marxist, the thing that you sense in terms of modern society isn't Marxist, they say it's Marxist. These scholars, they went to this magical meeting in 1989 in a church, and 30 scholars were there. The most famous names were Derek Bell, Crenshaw, Gene Stefanchik, and Richard Delgado, and they are the top dog. They are the titans in the critical social justice ideology. Now, within critical social justice, it divides into all these different units. You have critical race theory, you have critical gender studies, you have critical queer theory studies, you have critical is back to the scholastic engine, and it's a scholastic engine that produces papers that are peer-reviewed and published in journals.
Andrushka, you're cutting out.
Oh, am I cutting out? Can you hear me now?
It's like every other word or half of a word.
You might have to redirect your phone so that it's not.
Can you hear me now? Is that better?
That sounds better.
Okay. How long has that been going on? Did I miss a lot? Did you guys miss a lot of stuff?
It's been going on about 5 minutes, but I was taking notes through it all. So.
Oh.
I would repeat the part about Andrushka. I would repeat the part about the justice, critical justice, because I think that's where it started getting a little.
I hope that you got a little bit about what I was talking about, what the first course was about, which was the philosophical underpinnings and substrates, you could say, of this neo-Marxified ethos. I hope you guys got that, but the last lecture that I taught, the last lecture was critical social justice. And that was the last lecture before this new series. And what critical social justice is a scholastic engine that perpetuates all of the trash in terms of universities and stuff. So if you see a published paper, and that published paper is about how we need to commit incest, because if you don't commit incest, you're actively committing genocide against disabled people. Yes, that's an actual paper. You can look it up. It's called Critical Incest Discourse. And what they argue in the paper is that the idea that people have an aversion to incest, which is a biological aversion across all cultures that have ever existed. The paper argues that that's actually disabled genocide, because if you're not committing incest, what you're doing is you're preventing disabled people from being born, and that's genocide. That sounds crazy, but no, that was published in a journal, peer-reviewed journal. That's an example of the social justice, the critical social justice ideology. Critical social justice is that perpetuates this trash into the universities and into the journals and all that stuff. So when you see a paper on critical race theory or critical gender studies or critical feminist studies, it all goes back to that. It's all critical social justice, right? It's all Marxist. So critical social justice ideology is the ideology behind applying the Marxist faith system, applying it to culture and identity rather than economic and class. I hope that you guys I hope it didn't break out where I was trying to tell you guys that you have to understand what critical theory is. Not really the nitty and gritty, but that critical theory is Marxism. And every time you hear things like critical race theory, critical gender studies, SEL, it doesn't matter. It's all Marxism. And it's Marxism because it has the word critical in front of it. And critical theory, because I really don't know how much you guys missed out, critical theory is simply the tool used by neo-Marxists. Now that leads me to the – oh, I'm sorry.
Do you want me to hold my questions till the end?
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, questions are very important during the – yes, you may have a question. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I've studied critical theory and social emotional learning quite a bit, but how do you connect the idea of critical theory to social emotional learning? How would you do that?
So social emotional learning is what's called critical pedagogy, and pedagogy is the theory of education. When you put the word critical in front of it, it's Marxified. Social emotional learning is a product of a person, and I mentioned him, I hope you guys heard me, Paulo Freire, who solidified the Marxist faith system into the American institutions by attacking the institutions, because the institutions are the means by which society organically produces itself. It produces welders, nurses, it produces teachers, right? Attack the education, and you have attacked society and its means of production. Now, social emotional learning is the idea, first of all, social emotional learning, to sum it up in words that you could say sum it up almost completely, is state-sanctioned development. It's state-sanctioned character development, which is pretty messed up because it isn't to character develop your children. That is either a job for a trained clinician, or it is a job that is exclusively confined within the walls of your home. Never is it acceptable to character develop children in a state government context, which is a school. That's what social emotional learning is. Now, what it teaches is the idea that what it does, I would say first, is social emotional learning produces Marxist activists. So the byproduct of social emotional learning is Marxist activism. That's why social emotional learning, people who are influenced by its heavy curriculum, don't actually learn anything. What they learn is how to be raging Marxist activists. Mm-hmm. And I say it goes back to Paulo Freire because Paulo Freire wrote that the purpose of education is political and critical consciousness. It isn't about literacy. And he redefined literacy to mean the act of being politically awakened. Wait, he redefined literacy as the act of being politically awakened? It has nothing to do with proficiency or understanding mathematics? Nope. Paulo Freire says, no, throw all that out. The word literate means, for him, politically awakened. So what SEL's purpose is to produce Marxist activists. And you were asking how that fits into critical theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so critical theory is the center, and what happens when you apply critical theory is all of these different ramifications. You have critical race theory. Critical race theory is critical theory applied to race. You have critical gender studies. Critical gender studies is critical theory applied to gender studies. Critical women's studies is critical theory applied to women's studies, right? It goes on and on. Critical pedagogy is critical theory applied to pedagogy, which is the theory of education, right? That's where it connects. SEL is literally critical pedagogy. SEL is like you could say a catchphrase, social emotional learning. But if you look at what social emotional learning is, it's literally Freirean dogma. And Freire was the father of critical pedagogy. In other words, critical theory applied to the theory of education. Prior to Paulo Freire, the theory of education was liberal. It was John Dewey and Maria Montessori. But I'm not sure if that answers your question where it connects to critical. SEL is critical pedagogy incarnate. They're not inseparable. It's the same thing. SEL is just the layman's term, you could say, for a subset of critical theory. SEL is critical theory applied to theories of education, i.e. pedagogy. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
thank you.
Okay, so the last lecture was critical social justice ideology, and as I said, the magical meeting in '99, Madison, Wisconsin, 30 years gathered up, and that's when critical social justice ideology was born. It replaced the civil rights movement, and it explicitly, ruthlessly denied the civil rights movement its legitimacy. So the civil rights movement is just a product of the white Western male patriarchy, and they replaced it with social justice. Now, what social justice is a grand distribution scheme. The only purpose for social justice is to produce 50-50 parity among all the victim categories you can possibly fathom. So if it's disabled, we need just as much disabled people in this particular area. We need just as much black people in this, right? Social justice's idea only concerns distribution. And we won't get into detail as to why that's just utterly the wrong thing to do, why fundamentally suggesting that distribution is the way forward is in a lot of ways actually evil, because that's not today's lecture. Today's lecture, last lecture, was about equity, inclusion, and diversity. Some people call it DEI. There's other terms too. But we talked about that you have to master those words. And you have to master those words because that is the ultimate triad that the universities use. You see it everywhere. And now there are DEI officers. That's what they're called. I'm not joking. And DEI officers are literally commissars. Literally. They have DEI officers. They have diversity and equity inclusion officers. They have a department for diversity, equity, inclusion at almost every university you can possibly think of. This is a serious problem. If you understand what the equity and inclusion are, there should not ever be any type of sponsoring body supporting it. And the fact that you have officers means that it's literally communism. You are actually sponsoring and you are electing communists that represent this faith system. But we talked about how equity is socialism. Equity is a Marxist watchword, and all the words we're going to be discussing are Marxist watchwords. You have to remember that as well. Your radar has to go up when you hear these words. Equity, inclusion, and diversity are three of these words. Your radar has to go up as, hey, these are Marxist watchwords. They don't mean what they actually mean. They mean the complete opposite of what they mean. Inclusion, we discussed, means speech suppression. And inclusion, we discussed, means speech suppression no matter what. Because what inclusion is trying to produce a social environment in which it is impossible to be offended. Your marginalized status cannot be abridged. The problem with the idea that you can't be offended is you cannot speak without being offensive. It's not possible. If you're talking to 10 people, maybe you won't offend anybody. If you're talking to 20 people, maybe 30, how about 100? It doesn't matter who you are, and it doesn't matter what you could possibly ever say or fathom. You're going to offend at least 20 people. So inclusion is speech suppression. End of story. There is no way around that cold, hard fact. Inclusion is speech suppression. So diversity is another tricky word, right? Sounds pretty. No, it's not. And if you can master these words, you're on your way to mastering this Marxist ethos. Diversity means prioritizing superficial characteristics, but having an identical worldview. That identical worldview, obviously, is critical theory. So doing the work, being an anti-racist, right? They want to hire all these black people, right? And all these, maybe you could say Indians or disabled people or women, right? That's a diverse environment, right? Nope. If they don't have the exact same worldview, it's not diverse, and their voice isn't authentic. And this is going to lead into what we're going to be discussing today. If your diversity is defined by wanting superficial characteristics, which is your colored skin, differences in, you can even say eye color, your disability status, right? Get all these people in here. We want all these people who are different, right? That's diversity. That's what diversity means according to the English dictionary. That's not what they mean if you're a social critical justice ideologue. What it means is, yes, sure, that first step is satisfied. You have all these people, but where they differ, these Marxists, is they have to have the same worldview, and that is doing the work. That is the critical theorist zero-sum conflict lens worldview. If you don't view the world as a zero-sum conflict paradigm of identity categories, if you approach reality through that lens, you are not diverse. Your voice is not authentic. So diversity doesn't mean diversity. Diversity means having the exact same Marxified worldview. That worldview is called critical theory, which is upholding the lens of a Hobbesian zero-sum battleground of identity categories. You have to approach reality through that lens. If you don't do that, you are not authentic. You are not diverse. So don't let them lie. And equity is an easy one. Equity is just socialism, period. You don't need to think about that at all. It is a grand system of, it's a distribution scheme. It's not equality, and you have to have those to distinguish, because these Marxists that we're talking about hate equality. They hate equality. They hate it. You have to understand that equity is something completely different than equality. Equity is all about distribution and distributing to the point of transcending. So the goal at the end of the day is to transcend. So it gets pretty Gnostic and religious, and it gets crackpottery and stuff like that. But equity, just think of equity as socialism. It's rebranded socialism, and it's socialism in a very bad sense. It's socialism that suggests that what ultimately matters in reality is the fact that you are a group, right? What's secondary every single time is the fact that you're a person. They don't care if you're a person, because they don't care about you as a person, because people have a differential output every single time. If you put 2 people together, 3 people together, 5 people together, 100 people together, no matter what you do, there's going to be a differential output in what they produce or what they do with their mind and body. We can't have that. If there's a differential output, what that means is there's no equity. There's no leveling out the playing field, which is the ultimate goal for equity. So you have to deny the individual. That's the first step. And you have to assume that the group is primary on all dimensions of analysis. That's what equity is. So that was last lecture. That was the last lecture in those set of terms. So every lecture here on out will be a set of terms. And obviously, last lecture was DEI. So this lecture is slightly different. It's probably going to be slightly more, I guess you would say, nitty and gritty, easy to understand, because I'll be explaining it. But the lecture today is called Black Voices, Authenticity, and Lived Experience. I'm not sure if anybody's heard of these, but if you are immersed in the woke ideology trash, these are very hard, very high-level words. Black authenticity and lived experience. The second half of the title is Positional Standpoint Epistemology and the Subversion of the Objective. Now, to understand what Black Voices means, what authenticity means, what lived experience means, which are all the same terms, actually. You have to understand that first, is they're all the same terms. They all go back to what is called other ways of knowing, right? Because the ways of knowing of logic, deduction, inference, evidence, correspondence, right? Those are white ways of knowing. Those are ways of knowing that are a product of the white Western hegemonic, androcentric, cis heteronormative patriarchy, right? They believe that science is racist, right? So they replace these terms like evidence, logic, deduction, which is called epistemology, and they replace it with things like Black Voices, authenticity, and lived experience. Now, what are these terms? Where it gets a little nitty and gritty is actually what these terms mean. And so to begin with what these terms mean, and it's not just these, it's also, I think most people have heard of lived experience, right? So to explain what this means and what these words mean, which are very important because you're going to see these words every single day if you're on a university campus. are the people who have coined these terms, and the actual term for these words is actually called positional standpoint epistemology. So positional standpoint epistemology is replacing science and replacing objective truth and replacing everything that is considered to be a white Western way of knowing. And they replace it with, in simplistic terms, what's called other ways of knowing, right? So what they believe actually is that the imposition of your social status creates a structurally determinate system in which the lived experience becomes essentializable, tangible, and real. So if you're a black person, for example, you don't get to choose if you're black. That's a structurally determinate reality, right? So that means that the lived experience of being black, the social imposition of being black, is essentializable, real, and tangible. This leads to epistemologies with which they claim to be higher truth values, because your lived status happens along a deterministic trajectory. You don't get to choose whether you have black or blue eyes, or if you're disabled, or if you're transgender, because it happens along a deterministic trajectory. The lived experience of that process of being that victim is actually essentializable, real, and tangible in the same sense that objective reality is. Now, that is as complicated as it's going to get. This worldview is called positional standpoint epistemology, and what it's attempting to do is completely replace epistemological defaults like, as I've said, reason, logic, deduction, validity, and things like that. 1 second. I got to take this just take 2 seconds. Okay, so if you understand that, so black voices, for example, is a term that they believe has a higher truth value than maybe something like evidence in a court of law. This is why O.J. Simpson got away with actual murder. The O.J. Simpson case, for example, is the first case in American history where positional standpoint epistemology was injected into the legal system. And, when you do that kind of stuff, malicious murderers get away with actual murder. I don't need to get into details, but he was objectively found to be guilty of murder. But that didn't matter because his voice, and Johnny Cochran was his leading attorney, who was a racist piece of garbage, his voice, O.J. Simpson's voice, had higher truth value than the evidence and the logic and the correspondence and all the epistemological Western defaults, which are all white ways of knowing. Right? So when you inject this kind of standpoint epistemology into the legal system, evidence does not matter because evidence is a white way of knowing. There hasn't been any other cases where positional standpoint epistemology has been injected into the legal system, but that is actually their purpose. As a white heteronormative, paradigm, you could say. But black voices, for example, is another term. Black voices means that the fact that you're black means that you have lived an experience that has happened along a deterministic trajectory. And they call this materially determinism by racial category, or they can call it materially determinism by sexual category, material determinism by fat status category, right? Who you are and what your identity is, they believe happens along a deterministic trajectory. You don't have any control over it. And it is for that reason that they believe that the lived experience of your victim category is essentializable. You have to always remember that. It's essentializable, real, and tangible. This means they don't have to care about logic, reason, and evidence, right? Because those are just what they call other ways of knowing. And that's a very serious thing, because if you want to apply positional standpoint epistemology, or what the layman term is, other ways of knowing, and that's the term when you're not using scholastic language, is other ways of knowing. When you apply that to things like medicine, which is fundamentally evidence-based, you end up killing, 200,000 people, maybe 1 million, depending on the circumstances. If you apply this to the legal system, I don't know, you might be sending thousands of people in jail who actually are not guilty. And you might be sending murderers home to their families, like O.J. Simpson. The purpose of positional standpoint epistemology is to completely reject objective reality, because that's just a white way of knowing. As I mentioned, the second part of this lecture is positional standpoint epistemology and the subversion of the objective. So the purpose of the critical social justice ideology, and this is why they're all postmodernists. What's a fundamental tenet of postmodernism? Complete annihilation of meta-narratives. A complete annihilation of objective reality. Postmodernists don't believe that there's an objective reality. They believe that language terminates just at more language. Language doesn't terminate at reality. Language doesn't terminate at the objective world. What language does is it just terminates at more language, right? And so it's an ad infinitum process. They don't believe in an objective reality. So position standpoint epistemology is the tool that the social critical justice ideology uses as a way to defend that there's no objective reality, there's no truth. What's true is the fact that you're living a victim status. So you hear things like authentic voices, right, and lived experience and black voices. Authenticity is a term you'll hear all the time. Authenticity means that your voice has truth value if it involves a victim status. If your voice doesn't involve a victim status, which would be a white heteronormative heterosexual male, right, who isn't a Muslim and isn't black and isn't a woman, right? They're on the bottom of the totem pole. They're nothing that they say has authenticity, because they haven't lived the experience of the master-slave dialectic, you can call it, which is what Hegel called it. They didn't live the experience of being socially determinate. Society socially, so the critical social justice ideology, which is what all these terms are, all these terms are within that paradigm, the critical social justice ideology. With these terms, they don't believe in an objective reality, and they don't believe in an objective reality in the same sense postmodernists deny an objective reality. So you could say this is an extension of postmodernism. And I would mention, when you hear black voices, authenticity, and lived experience, you have to understand that they're all the same thing. They're a rejection of objective reality, because objective reality is, I'm sure people have heard that math is racist. I'm sure people have heard that Newton's Principia Mathematica Rate Manual, right? This all goes back to this tool. This tool is called standpoint epistemology, positional standpoint epistemology. This is the tool that they use to object reality for lived experience. So the nitty and gritty is understanding what lived experience is. And I have to keep mentioning it in these terms because it's not an easy concept to understand. It's heavily philosophical and it's heavily postmodern. But as long as you understand that what they believe fundamentally is that your victim status, your victim category, is socially imposed and structurally determined. Again, of course, you don't get to decide what your color of skin is, or that you're a woman, or that you're disabled. You don't get to decide where you are on that hierarchy. Therefore, the lived experience of being wherever you are on the hierarchy is essentializable, real, and tangible. In the same sense, science is objective. In the same sense that So this is their approach of objecting science, and where this is applied, as I've said, was O.J. Simpson, but in many other cases too. So if you ever heard of fat studies actually suggests that wanting to lose weight is an internalized form of fat phobia, and that science is a grand conspiracy theory rooted in the systemic hatred of fat people. Like, are you freaking kidding me? I'm not. This is actually published in scholastic journals. Again, as I said, this all leads back to the scholastic engine, which is called critical social justice ideology. It's all critical social justice. Prior to critical social justice, what did you have? You had civil rights. You had civil liberties, right? So I'm going to go on to the next part, but I want to actually ask if anybody has questions in terms of what's been said so far. What does black voices mean? What does authenticity mean? What does lived experience mean? These are the words you should master. And you really don't have to do much mastering because they actually all mean the same thing. They're just different words. Black voices is the same thing as lived experience. And lived experience is the same thing as authenticity, and authenticity is the same thing as black voices. But these are the words you'll hear everywhere if you're exposed to the Marxist ethos. So are there any questions about these terms before I move on to the second part of this lecture here? Any questions? No questions? Okay. So the hard part is the philosophy behind all this. So we mentioned a little bit of it. The philosophy is structural determinism by racial category, structural determinism by fat status category, structural determinism by feminist category, or the femininity category, structural determinism by whatever victim status we're talking about. And because, as I've mentioned, that critical theory is the result of shifting the domain of analysis, the Marxian domain of analysis, away from the economic and class, which are rigid categories. You can't mess with those, and into identity and culture. You have all these things. You have all this trash scholarship. You have all these terms now that you see in university courses and the university course curriculum. Like feminist studies, are you serious? Critical race theory, are you kidding me? Critical fact studies, critical legal studies. It goes on and on and on. There's so many because they don't have to stand on their predictions. Culture and identity are malleable things. So you can instantiate Marxism and all these things and get away with it. You can't do that with class and culture. And Lukács and Anton Gramsci found that out first, and they said, Marxism just doesn't work because it's not science. It's just actually crackpot religion. But we like this crackpot religion, so we're going to shift the domain of analysis away from something less rigid and fixed into something that's far more malleable, far more not fixed. And so understand the complicated term, positional standpoint epistemology. That's the tool used to justify that there's no objective reality. And if you're woke, you don't believe there's an objective reality. End of story. There isn't a person who's woke who is not vehemently against the idea that objective reality. If you're woke, it means you don't believe in an objective reality. What you believe is that your victim status holds epistemological truth values that are higher than objective values. Black voices, authenticity, and lived experience. Understand that positional standpoint epistemology is the tool for this, is the tool for objective reality. Within the layman's term, also understand, you can write this down, the layman's term is other ways of knowing. And you'll see that much more than you'll see positional standpoint epistemology. But if you understand that other ways of knowing is positional standpoint epistemology, and vice versa, you have mastered this section. And the purpose of other ways of knowing, which is at universities, they have what's called culturally sensitive training, culturally sensitive teaching, because they believe that you need to have an assortment of cultural views in things like medicine. You need to have other perspectives, right? I don't think you need other people's perspectives in solid state physics. I think science is just fine in terms of solid state physics. I don't think you need the indigenous perspective. No, they believe so. They believe so because their lived experience has a higher epistemological truth value than objective truths. So you'll see in universities nowadays that all these classes, you could say, that involve science and objective reality has instantiated all this trash about we need more lived experience in the curriculum. So are there any questions about positional standpoint epistemology and other ways of knowing? Has anybody heard of other ways of knowing?
No, I got a question. Can
Sure.
you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
What? So did you classify transgender in the same class as not being able to pick your race or your eye color? Or did I misunderstand
that? So being transgender is a victim status. So if it involves a victim status, what they do is they apply critical theory. And yes, or the answer to your question is yes, with some more added to it. But yes, if you can fathom a victim status, that's all you have to do is fathom some type of victim status. You can apply critical theory to it. And that's what they do. They try to come on, fat studies? Are you serious? Queer dance theory? Are you freaking kidding me? Go ahead.
You personally don't put them in the same class.
Class as?
Same. You personally aren't saying that being transgender is the same thing as being born black or being born with a certain eye color. They don't pick that. They're born that way. Is that your opinion, or is that their opinion that you're telling us?
Their opinion is that all victim statuses happen along a deterministic trajectory. That includes being a transgender. They believe that you can't choose to be a transgender because society has imposed it upon you, right? What society has imposed is what's called heteronormativity. What society has imposed is called being straight, right? These are societal fictions, they say. And being transgender is a deterministic process. You don't get to choose to be transgender. And it's the fact that you don't get to choose, which means that the lived experience of being transgender has higher value than objective reality. And this is why they can get away with everything. Does that answer your question in some ways?
Yeah, that answered the question. I was just curious if that was your belief, or if that's just a teaching that they're pushing on people. That's all.
So my beliefs are actually strictly confined to what the scientific literature says. Right. It is actually my expertise. The pre and post neuroendocrinological literature determines those kinds of questions and those kinds of answers. And that's all I go to. I'm not concerned with sociological studies or even anthropological studies. I want to know what the facts are in terms of the objective realities.
Okay.
But I can see why you may have that question, because part of trans rights is the idea that you get to choose whether you're trans or get to choose whether or not this or that. And part of the Marxist ethos suggests that that's the case, that the rights should come forth because you can make the choice. And that may sound true, that's actually not what they believe. That is actually just a political stunt to get what they want. They know that being transgender is not a choice. But it looks good when you're trying to make a political move, or when you're trying to take it up to the bureaucratic front. It looks good because choosing is what you do in a liberal society. But no, if you really want my opinion, the facts are that transgender people don't get to choose whether or not they're trans. In the same sense that one doesn't choose other behavioral manifestations that happen along deterministic trajectories. But that's an entirely different conversation we'll be discussing in other terminology, other words that have been hijacked in terms of that subject. It's another point to make is that there are people out there who aren't trans who say they're trans. So being transgender, for example, is extremely rare. It is not common at all. I'm sorry, it's not. They want to suggest that it is common, and the fact that it's not common is just proof that there's a heteronormative white cis androcentric patriarchy. it is extremely uncommon to have that type of sexual dimorphism, and they want to say it's not. So the answer to your question is actually twofold. The answer to your question is no, they don't believe it. But the other answer is they believe it's a choice in the sense that a lot of the people who claim to be are actually just ideologues. And that's actually factual.
I mean, they're cross-dressing.
And
in layman's terms?
You could say that. Transgender, though, or in more technical terms, are people who actually do suffer from what's called gender dysphoria.
And I get that.
But the point is, gender dysphoria is an extreme. Yes, it is extremely rare, and I would know that because I know the literature behind my head. I know the literature with my eyes closed. I have personally conducted some of the studies. I'm familiar with the titans who are in this field of scholarship. And everybody's if you're a scientist, everybody's pointing in the same direction. The direction is no, this is a very rare disorder. No, it is not common. Critical social-justice ideology wants to say no, very common. And the fact that it's not common for them means that there is some type of toxic, heteronormative, androcentric patriarchy. That's why it's not common, is because it's being oppressed, you know. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, maybe about that subject or the tool they use to object to reality, the tool they use to dismantle objective reality? No question? Is there a Q&A people are interested in?
I'm just trying to let it all soak in my brain right now.
If you have any questions, just literally feel free to ask if something doesn't make sense.
I've never heard of other ways of knowing, but I can tell you that the generation that is in college right now and what you are saying, I see that in them.
Yep. So other ways of knowing is basically saying that there is this traditional way of knowing, which involves evidence, logic, correspondence, things like reason and things like that. But those are just white ways of knowing. Those are just Western ways of knowing. Those are just cis heteronormative ways of knowing. Those are just straight ways of knowing. That's not good enough. They need other ways of knowing. And that's what positional standpoint epistemology is the tool by which that's affected.
Well,
and
that helps for you to list the other ways of knowing other than just white ways of knowing. You said Western ways, and what else did you say?
Yep, Western ways, straight ways, cis heteronormative ways, ableist ways. So as I said, there's so many different victim paradigms. There's so many different victim statuses because critical theory applies to culture and identity, which is malleable, and you can perpetuate all this trash. You can't do that prior because economics and culture, or economics and class are fixed categories. That's why you see all these things. And so the epistemology of this scholarship is what we've been talking about. And it's a victim category. Now, it sums it up. What it all sums up to is the fact that there is the Western way of knowing, the cis heteronormative way of knowing, the mass way of knowing, right? All these victim paradigms or statuses. It all comes down to the fact that you can say mathematics, right? You can say, which uses logic. Logic is a white way. Logic is a cis heteronormative way of knowing. Logic is a masculine way of knowing, right? Because men invented logic, men invented science, you know. straight people invented logic, straight people invented science. So it goes on and on and on. It all goes back to reason and the Enlightenment, and they hate both things. They hate the Enlightenment, and they hate reason. And reason, when you don't reason, what you have are other things like deduction, correspondence, validity, right? When you group all that together, the philosophical term for that is called epistemology. In other words, ways by which we are able to know something, right? What do you think is the appropriate way by which to know something? Do you think it might be through maybe reason and logic and deduction and validity and correspondence, right? That's the problem. So positional standpoint epistemology is trashing all that, which is called traditional ways of knowing, as opposed to other ways of knowing, and replacing it with your lived experience. Because again, your lived experience, the fact that you're black, the fact that you're transgender and that you're Muslim, your lived experience is socially imposed along a deterministic trajectory. You don't get to choose if you're Muslim. You don't get to choose if you're black. That's a deterministic process. It makes it a process that you don't have to choose. Because it's a deterministic process, it means that the lived experience of that oppression, the consciousness of that oppression, is essentializable, real, and tangible. And that's the argument they make. And that's why they believe that's their justification for believing that reason, logic, deduction, correspondence, validity, argument, they believe all that is just traditional ways of knowing. And traditional ways of knowing for them are the problem. They don't like science. They hate science, right? So positional standpoint epistemology is the tool that they use in feminist studies, for example, right? They deny biology in feminist studies completely. They don't care about biology. Why? Because that's biology involves reason, logic, deduction, inference, validity, correspondence, right? Biology is a white way of knowing. No, they want it, and they want to replace it with woman's experience, right? Same thing with critical race theory. They're critical race theorists. They believe that race is a socially imposed category, and that this socially imposed category happens along deterministic trajectory. You don't get to choose if you're black or white or Latino or whatever, right? And it's the fact that you can't choose that makes the lived experience of that imposition essentializable, real, and tangible. So they want to replace legal reasoning, for example, with this epistemological standpoint epistemology. That's why O.J. Simpson got away with murder, is because he played the race card, and he played the race card with positional standpoint epistemology. In other words, with other ways of knowing. And so, yeah, it's all very, very, very messed up, especially since now this postmodern trash is being perpetuated into the universities as if it were legitimate knowledge. It's not legitimate knowledge. It's all racialized. It's all sexist. It's all right. Did you have a question?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Why is it being enforced through administration of colleges and universities?
Repeat that question.
See, I would have thought that things, thinking like this would come from the bottoms up, or where people would want to enforce it, or people would want to bring it into the curriculum or something more voluntary. But what I'm seeing is that it is being enforced from the top up, from the administration level, where you have to have so many commissars, as you call them. You have to have all of these programs, and it is becoming, it is almost like an edict that is coming from somewhere. And what occurs to me, I mean, I'm just thinking loud, okay, that possibly this is part of a communist movement, because from what I've heard from all of the other sessions that you've been talking about, that all of this terminology and all of this activity is part of a communistic, not socialistic, the full-fledged communistic movement. So if it is part of the communist movement, which is not part of America, we have a law against it, how come that this is being enforced by administration of universities and colleges? Or
so your question has two
corporate.
Your question has two answers. The first answer is it's not maybe communism, it's not probably communism, it actually is communism. But the term that you use when you switch the domain of analysis away from the economic and class and into identity and culture, it's not called communism, it's called neo-Marxism, which is communism, right? So the other term you could use is neo-communism. It's not a question of whether or not it's communism. It is communism, and it's communism because the scholars that we're going to be discussing in the next course say it's communism. So it's not something you need to think about. It's not something that you need to look into. The people perpetuating this trash, the PhDs that are perpetuating this trash, like Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, Gene Spontrick, Delgado, and right, I can name 100 more. They themselves say it's communism, right? They use the term neo-communism.
Right, but why is it coming from the administration of American universities and American business? And
so that's the second. Yes, that is the second of the question, and the answer to that goes back to Herbert Marcuse and the famous question that Paul Boole asked in one of his famous texts: where did all the radical 60s? Where did all the radicals of the 60s go? They didn't go to the freaking cults, I'll tell you that, and they didn't go to the Epidum. They went to the universities. Now, what happens when these people go to the university? What is a university? A university is an education institution that has only one purpose, and that purpose is to reproduce society. And how that works is if you're an education institution, you're reproducing society because what you're producing are welders. What you're producing are doctors and teachers and lawyers, right? Educational institutions, the purpose is to reproduce society. Now, if you attack the educational institutions, the means by which society actually organically reproduces itself, if you attack that, you have the answer to your question. Why is it the administration? Why is it the colleges that are perpetuating this stuff? Because they have been poisoned by the asp. This asp was Paul Freire and his what's called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. The reason why they're supporting this from a top-down analysis is because they're already poisoned. It's not they're becoming poisoned. It's not they're on their way to becoming poisoned. When I mentioned in the Paulo Freire lecture that they won the game, this is exactly what I meant. They win the game. They won the game because if you attack the institutions, the colleges and educational institutions, which are the only possible means by which society reproduces itself, you win the game. You win the game from a top-down analysis. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you. So that answers the question how it's getting into the public school system because the colleges are reproducing teachers like I was before I was on.
Yep. That's exactly it. There's a famous Marxist term in Marxist literature called the problem of reproduction. And so what Paulo Freire did was his book actually solved that problem. And nobody solved it until that man. And that problem is you have a teacher and you have a student, right? And the teacher is the knower and the student is the learner. That's by definition a negative power dynamic, right? Oh, we can't have negative power dynamics because I'm a bloody Marxist. We can't have that. We have to tear down any possible negative power dynamic that there exists, right? Paulo Freire solved the problem of reproduction. The problem of reproduction states Why does society keep reproducing itself with these negative power dynamics, right? Well, it goes back to the negative power dynamic between the student and the teacher. So what Paulo Freire did was he injected the idea of discourse, the idea of dialogical learning. In other words, dialogue was the primary means by which you educate children. And this is important if you understand SEL. Dialogue means that you're equals. When you're talking to someone in dialogue, it means you're equals. There's no power dynamic, right? You're not teaching him, and you're technically not learning technically. So traditional education involves a power dynamic that keeps on reproducing itself, and that's a negative power dynamic. It's a good negative power dynamic because I want children to learn, right? There's a knower and there is a learner, right? You have a teacher and a student. That is a negative power dynamic. Paulo Freire says, no, scrap that. Now the teacher and the student are in the act of dialogue, because in dialogue you are equals. And what that does is, from that point on, you're not reproducing that power dynamic. You're not reproducing what's called the problem of reproduction in Marxist terminology. What you're producing are ideologues. What you're producing are Marxist activists. It's no longer about learning, because learning by definition means negative power dynamic. Learning means that there is a learner. Learning means that there is a teacher. That's a negative power dynamic in it. And if you're a Marxist, you have to dismantle it. You have to remove it. Paulo Freire did that, and he solved this ancient old Marxist problem, reproduction. Why does society keep on reproducing itself with these negative power dynamics? And so if you introduce dialogue into the school curriculum as the operative means by which one learns, you're not learning anything, because you have to have that negative power dynamic to learn something. Someone has to know more than you in order for you to learn something. That's not good enough. So if you're able to attack that by redefining literacy, I suppose the two things that Paulo Freire did, he introduced what's called the dialogic model of education, which completely annihilated traditional education by John Dewey and Montessori and the liberal ways of education, which suggests that there's a learner and there's a teacher, and that's how it should be. You should be learning in class, for one thing, right? In order to learn, you have to be subject to a negative power dynamic because the teacher knows more than you. Paulo Freire replaced that with what's called the dialogical model, and he then introduced liberation theology into the school curriculum, which is what critical pedagogy is. It's liberation theology. It suggests that the purpose of education isn't to become literate, it's to become activists. And so that's what today's education is about. It's fundamentally a full-fledged activist project.
That is all that learning. That's the only kind of education that takes place in schools now is dialogical learning.
Yes,
and
that's a bad thing. It sounds off to suggest that dialogue doesn't belong in the classroom. It doesn't belong in the classroom. Dialogue belongs in the common square. Right? Dialogue belongs maybe in the privacy of your own home. In a classroom, it doesn't belong because the teacher and the student are not equals, and they should not be equals if you want anybody to learn anything. Right. But if you are not equals, then you're a problem. You're perpetuating the system of negative power dynamics. So the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is his book, Paulo Freire's book, solved that problem that Marxists couldn't solve. Why does society keep on reproducing itself? We don't want society to reproduce itself. We want to dismantle and completely overthrow society, right? Part of the definition of society is a system that reproduces itself onto the next generation. Nope, you can't have that if you're a Marxist. The purpose is transcendence. The purpose is liberation. The purpose is humanization. It's a crackpot religion. Paulo Freire was one of the leading Marxists in the world at the time, and nobody has to ask whether or not he was a Marxist. It's not a question. What is today's curriculum? It's Marxism. Why? Because Paulo Freire is the father of today's school ethos. He is. If you go to any university college campus and you go to the educational department, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed is on their desk. End of story. It is the most cited book in the world right now. Literally. I think it's actually third. It's the third most cited book in the world right now. and it's a religious manual. It is liberation theology posing as education theory. And you just have to read his chapter on brainwashing. You just have to read his chapter on humanization, right? These terms should not exist in an educational department, much less that freaking book. And so SEL is Freirean dogma and its story. Are there any more questions?
Andrushka, do you think, this is Michael, do you think that the falling scores that are the average measured scores every year appears to be falling? Do you think that CT indoctrination may have something to do with this, since there's just mostly a dialectic rather than the normal?
So the data on that, yes, you're actually correct. So there is actually hard data, and the data I can send links to the actual data, but there is a decline in proficiency output, and if you go to places where Paulo Freire's method has been applied to their extremes, such as Rhode Island, the literacy rate has actually exponentially dropped, and for that reason. Now, not all schools apply SEL and culturally responsive teaching and anything that involves Freirean dogma, right? A lot of schools do, but the schools that take it to the most extremes, such as Rhode Island, and you can look up, their proficiency rate is the worst in the United States. And there is a linear relationship between the amount of Freirean dogma that's in an institution and the educational output, proficiency output. That linear relationship, actually, you can graph that on paper. It's not something that you can't just deny that stuff. It is a matter of fact that the more you apply Freirean liberation theology, i.e. critical pedagogy, the less they're going to become literate. Because in an SEL framework, it's not about learning. And it's explicitly not about learning. If you read the SEL handbooks, they don't care about learning. They care about socially developing children without license, I may have you. So teachers are not clinicians, and they're not social workers. They belong in prison for thinking it's okay to actually character develop your children. And if you go to the Blue Dot, which is a social emotional learning book, it's actually one of the top dog books. It was published by UNESCO. One of the key terms that they use is character development. Now, I use the word character development when I'm dealing with policy and stuff like that. And people get pissed off. It's like, I didn't make up that word. Character development is actually what they're doing because they said so. They say so. It isn't the state's job to character develop your children. That's messed up. Character developing your children is an exclusive practice of a licensed clinician. And if you're doing it and you're not licensed or you're not a parent, you belong in prison. And to sum up social emotional learning, which we'll get into later actually, in simplistic terms, you have to understand that what it is character development on children. It's psychological character development on children, which doesn't belong, and it's not a coincidence. Marx had an entire chapter about where the child should be raised. And Marx believed that the child should be raised by the government. I wonder if social emotional learning has any Marxist overtones. Well, the fact that the father of social emotional learning, the philosophical underpinnings, is Paulo freaking Freire, that should give it away to you right there. But the other fact that it takes the Marxist-Leninist view that the education and the development of the child is a state matter, that should settle everything. If you're not convinced after those facts that social emotional learning is just patent Marxism, you're actually suffering from a delusional disorder. So yeah, that's what I have to say about SEL. It gets more detailed. We're going to be there's going to be a lecture on some of the terminology used in SEL. That sounds pretty, but really isn't. they're just more Marxist watchwords. But yeah, are there any more questions about that, I guess?
I don't have a question. I have, it's kind of an observation, I suppose, that from what you're saying, I'm getting the idea that all they want to do is make very weak children to grow up as weak people so that they become easy to control and enslaved. Am I right in my surmise?
So, yes, and there's scholarship actually to support that. There is what they call drag queen story hour. And this is just an example. I'm giving an example. I could provide 1,000 more of just blatant facts. So one of the scholars on drag queen story hour, and yes, there are scholars on freaking drag queen story hour. Would you believe that? Her name is Hannah Dyer, and she has a PhD in English, I think. Go figures. She's a postmodernist. And she's explicitly said in one of her seminal works that the purpose of drag queen story hour is to destabilize childhood innocence so that they can become politically moldable. And that is the only purpose of drag queen story hour, is to destabilize childhood innocence, which is considered to these crackpots as a barrier. If you can destabilize it, then they can become politically moldable. When you apply that to other things, such as critical race theory, such as critical fact studies, feminist studies, gender studies, right? It's all the same thing. The purpose is to destabilize the current hegemony that's been normalized into the lives of people, into individuals, to destabilize it so that they can become politically moldable. That's one of the purposes of the Marxist faith system, actually, is to destabilize society.
Can I
one of the
real quick?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Are you saying politically moldable like clay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There is a special term in the Marxist faith system called, it's a magical term, it's called class consciousness, and it's a fundamental term in anything Marxist. What class consciousness is metaphysics dressed up in economic language, right? Class consciousness sounds like an economic term. It's not. It's actual Gnostic religious cult crap. What class consciousness is the idea that you have special access to knowledge. You have this special access and insight to knowledge that isn't arrived at through normal epistemological defaults, right? We've talked about what those defaults are. They're the white ways of knowing. They're logic, deduction, correspondence, reason, validity, right? You have special access to this kind of knowledge that isn't arrived at through those normal means, through means of reason and logic, right? If something is arrived at not through those epistemological defaults, what is it? It's cult religion. Class consciousness suggests that you as a victim have and are afforded special insight to reality. Now, the term that people use nowadays is called woke. Woke is literally class consciousness. The terms people today now use is authenticity. The terms people use are black voices. The terms people use are other ways of knowing, right? This is the Gnostic cult crap that I'm talking about. It is an extension of what Marx called class consciousness. You have special insight to reality. And this special insight isn't arrived at through normal epistemological defaults. And this kind of goes into what Narveen was saying in terms of how possibly could people be falling for this crap. You would have to either be born into it, or you would have to actually have fallen for it. And there really isn't anything in between or on the edges of that. But in terms of being politically moldable, are there any questions about that? Because that's a very serious subject.
I have a question
end goal.
On your topic. Go ahead. Sorry. Somebody's speaking.
Oh, go ahead. You were saying?
Me?
Yeah, go ahead,
On
Narveen.
your topic, you have positional standpoint piecemeal. So what is positional standpoint? What do you mean by that?
So what they mean by it, actually, so this positional standpoint epistemology is their term. So if you're a scholar or PhD in the wokeology, this is the term you'd be using. Positional standpoint means where you are on the victim status, where you are on the victim totem pole, where you are on the victim hierarchy. And that where you are specifically means that the imposition of your social status, of your victim status, is essentializable because it happens along a deterministic trajectory. Epistemology means just knowledge. It means how does one arrive at knowledge, right? Well, traditionally, it used to be, things you arrive at knowledge through epistemology. What is epistemology? Epistemology is reason and logic and deduction, validity and correspondence, and right? No, you add on positional standpoint. What you have is epistemology predicated and fundamentally contingent on the fact of your victim status. Your victim status affords you special insight into reality. That's why this woke crap is actually the religion. The technical term is Gnostic. So these woke people are what's called, they're Gnostics. They believe that you have special insight into reality that isn't arrived at through epistemology. It's arrived at through positional standpoints. And what you arrive at through that is things like lived experience and authenticity and black voices and all that trash. Will that answer some of your question, though?
Yes, I have one more. What do you mean by, on your topic, you had subversion of the objective? And that's a very interesting term, a very interesting phrase. What do you mean by that?
So the subversion of the objective, if you're woke, you deny reality. And usually reality consists of the objective. You fundamentally deny reality. And you deny reality because you have a tool. And that tool is called positional standpoint epistemology. This is why O.J. Simpson was able to get away with actual murder, malicious, calculating murder. He was able to get away with it because it wasn't a matter about the evidence, was it? It wasn't a matter about legal reasoning, because those are just all white, heteronormative, androcentric constructs. We need other ways of knowing. So they injected positional standpoint epistemology and subverted the objective. Objective in the sense of objective reality. It's the subversion of objective reality, or everything that which is objective. So that includes legal reasoning. Legal reasoning is fundamentally predicated on what's called correspondence. And O.J. Simpson was able to get away with that with actual calculating malicious murder because his legal team, headed by John Cochran, decided to subvert the objective. And they were able to do that by using and injecting positional standpoint epistemology, replacing legal reasoning. And so that's what critical legal studies is. I think I mentioned kind of briefly critical legal studies. The purpose of critical legal studies as of now is to replace legal reasoning, right? That involves evidence and facts and logic, right? They want to replace that with positional standpoint epistemology. Because what really matters is the color of your skin. What really matters is the fact that you're transgender. What really matters is the fact that you're disabled, right? It doesn't matter that you're a person. What matters is all these victim categories, right? And the way they can substantiate that claim and legitimize it is, again, through positional standpoint epistemology. I did mention at the beginning of this lecture here that this is going to be the most complicated lecture, this one. But once you get this out of the way, everything else is going to be very easy. But yeah, so are there any more questions in terms of the title, Black Voices, Authenticity, and Lived Experience, Positional Standpoint Epistemology, and the Subversion of the Objective?
Thank you.
And it's not a coincidence also, by the way. Yeah. It's not a coincidence also that everybody we're going to be speaking about in the next course, it's not a coincidence that every single one of them are postmodernists. Either postmodernists, neo-Marxists. Every single one. You're not going to find a single one who's not a Marxist or a postmodernist.
So I have a question. You said they won. Well, we need to reverse that. So what?
I said what?
I mean, you said that they won on the agenda of having.
Well, they've won in the sense I didn't say they. Well, I said they won in the sense of hijacking the American institution and the American Academy. I didn't say necessarily that they won the actual process. So we live in a liberal society, which means that people are treated as people in the end. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is. It doesn't matter if you're a transgender. And in that sense, they have not won. We still have a constitution. And yes, the woke hate the Constitution. And in that sense, they have not won. And I'm not saying they hate the Constitution because I'm against the woke or I am anti-woke. I'm saying they hate the Constitution because they themselves have hated the Constitution. And this is actually what's about the next. Yeah, the next. I mean, I can actually point it out verbatim. I can point it out per paragraph of the most eminent scholars in this trash, where they explicitly say that the Constitution has to be completely dismantled and overthrown. One of the most famous is. Has anybody heard of Kimberly Crenshaw? Anybody?
I've heard that name. I don't know where.
She is one of the titans, and she explicitly says in a book called Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which technically was written by Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanchik. These three people were at the magical meeting in 1989, by the way, that cult meeting in 1989. She says in that book, they say in that book, that we have to subvert the liberal order, that we completely reject liberalism. We completely reject constitutional law. We completely reject legal reasoning. We completely reject incrementalism. This is in Chapter 1 in Introduction, subsection A. When I say that they want to overthrow the Constitution, I'm not trying to be emotional. Everything that I say is according to these scholars, these Marxists, which is what makes me bulletproof, to be honest with you, because you can't. The next course is actually about going into these scholars and their works, and that the second method of fighting all this trash, the first method is to master the linguistic game, master the terminology that they have hijacked. The second way of fighting back, and there's only two ways, is understanding that the way to fight back in the end is to cite their own scholars. And it works every time because you can't, it's not possible. You'd be fighting yourself on your own terms. It's a form of self-annihilation. If they want to fight me, if they want to fight anybody who's educated on this subject and knows how to fight back, they have to, it is a process of self-annihilation. And those are just, so this course is obviously the first method of fighting. I didn't mention that in the beginning. The course we're on is, there are two ways to fight back. This course right now is the first way. And we're going to be, the first way is to master the linguistic territory that they have hijacked, such as words like equity and inclusion and diversity, which all sound pretty, right? We'll be getting into other terms that sound pretty. The purpose is that they sound pretty. That's their goal. If it sounds pretty, they win in that respect. It sounds pretty, but it's not. They're all neo-Marxist watchwords, and you have to have your radar up for that. I'm developing your radar. That's what I'm doing in this course. I'm developing your radar. Black Voices, Authenticity, Lived Experience. Radar should pop up. What is that? It's the objection of reality, of objective reality. It's positional standpoint epistemology. It's other ways of knowing. You're going to hear that a lot. Other ways of knowing is something you're going to hear a lot. Your Marxist radar should go up, and it should be crimson red. Any more questions?
Hey, I have one more question. Oh, sorry, Tanya. This is Rebecca. So Tanya has touched on SEL a lot, but we also have restorative justice practices here, and they're calling it that now. They didn't call it that for a long time. Are you going to touch on that, or is that part of? Yep.
So restorative justice will be covering terms which are part of the restorative justice project. Okay. So yes, there's going to be a lot of terms on that. So each lecture actually is going to be like a triad of terms, and there is going to be one on restorative justice. because it's within restorative justice that you have all these other pretty terms. And so yes. And restorative justice, by the way, is basically a mass-scale attempt of group guilt. And group guilt, obviously, is the number one first ingredient to genocide, because groups can't be guilty. How can a group be guilty if the site of moral autonomy and the site of responsibility is on the individual level? In all realities, right? The individual is the sovereign, not the group. But yeah, we'll be talking about that and why that kind of trash is, evil like everything else that's been going on. And it's evil in the sense that you aren't people if you believe this kind of stuff. You're not a person. What you fundamentally are is a group. And that's where your ontology ends. The ontological status is on the group level. You don't have any moral autonomy. You don't have any moral agency. You don't have any of that. You're not a person if you believe this worldview, this neo-Marxist, postmodern, zero-sum, fatalistic, lensed worldview. You're not a person. But yeah, is there another person who had a question that seemed?
I was finishing at the question. You said there's two ways to fight, and right now you're teaching all the terms to help us fight. What was the other one?
Yep. The other one is, so the process involves, for example, I'll give you an example to try to illustrate. Critical race theory isn't Marxist, is a very large thing. How do you fight that back? Well, you do it where the process ends in them self-annihilating. You cite their scholars. You cite Kimberly Crenshaw. You cite Gene Stefancic and Richard Delgado. You cite critical race theorists. You don't go and try to make a logical argument as to why CRT is Marxist, right? Another stupid one is CRT isn't in the schools. Well, it is in the schools because CRT scholars says it is. So the second course will be about citing the scholars, and it's basically an entire system that if someone wants to claim something like CRT isn't Marxist, which is a very, very large claim, and it's just it's a lie and it's a delusion. What you would do in that instance, and this is what you'll be learning, is you will cite critical race scholars, because critical race theorists say it's Marxist. You don't have to do any thinking. You don't have to try to formalize an argument as to why it's Marxist. Kimberly Crenshaw says it's Marxism. And if you want to argue with that, that's fine. You're going to be arguing with the scholars. You're going to be arguing with the radical Marxist critical race theorists. You can't argue with them because they are the movement. They are the scholars. You can't argue with them because they are what the theory is incarnate. So that's the second course, is understanding the scholars. Who are these people? And there's really only 15 major ones. There's a little over 30, but the big ones there's about 15 in terms of the critical social justice ideology, which includes obviously critical race theory, gender studies, right? The idea that another example I can give you, and I'm going to be giving you all the examples about it. But another one is that critical queer theory, if anybody's heard of that, doesn't involve pedophilia. Well, except for the fact that the fairy godmother of queer theory herself, Gail Rubin, literally defends pedophilia in her book called Thinking Sex in the first chapter. I mean, if you're going to write something about sex or something like that, you're going to begin by defending pedophilia. One of her most famous quotes is, "Pedophiles are sexualized minorities that need to be liberated." How is someone going to fight against you? How is someone going to come up to you and tell you that they don't support pedophilia, when the scholars themselves support pedophilia? Like, not just any scholars. I'm talking about the fairy godmother of queer theory. there's two of them. There's Judith Butler and Gail Rubin. Their scholarship, that means what they have written, is the summation of all queer theory. Nobody else writes about queer theory, right? Queer theory involves things like Drag Queen Story Hour, adding another letter to the LGBTQ, that's what you're going to be learning in the next lecture, or in the next series.
Who was it that quoted the Drag Queen Story Hour that was to destabilize childhood innocence so they can become politically mobile?
Yep.
Who was that quoted?
So that's Hannah. Her name is Hannah Dyer, and she's the leading scholar in the world right now on Drag Queen Story Hour.
Okay, thank you.
I can give you the direct article as well. Let's see here. Yeah, so it's a peer review article, which means that it was established and it was accepted by a panel of experts. I'm going to open up my database here. But yes, it was Hannah Dyer. One of the other founders of Drag Queen Story Hour is a person named Little Miss Hot Mess. She's a drag queen. You also have to understand that what drag queens are not transsexuals, which is kind of funny because it contradicts the whole thing. Drag queens are, by definition, like the definition of a drag queen, is a hypersexualized male clown. It's a person who is a male, and they're a clown, and they're hypersexualized. So don't let anybody else tell you that a drag queen is a transgender, because they're not. They're worse than that, because they're not dealing with an actual ailment. That's further proof of the fact that the purpose of Drag Queen Story Hour is to destabilize childhood innocence. Because drag queens are not even disabled. They don't have a mental condition. They're ideologues. But yeah. Are there any more questions about Drag Queen Story Hour or whatever?
I have a question. Like you're talking about the solution, and one thing that keeps coming to my mind when you mention the Constitution, we have a law in America that's from the 1800s, and it has never been turned over or overturned or anything, and that's the case called Madison versus Marbury, which says very clearly that anything against the Constitution is null and void. So when they're making statements that what surprises me that, or the things that you're telling us over here, so much of that is against, and they're openly saying that it's against the Constitution. How come that they don't get sued, or how come it's being accepted because of this one precedent in our law which says anything against the Constitution is null and void?
Yes. So the answer to that is actually twofold again. As far as I am concerned, Marbury versus Madison is a Supreme Court case that established judicial review. So what you would have to do in order for the Constitution to strike something down as unconstitutional is you'd have to go through all the Federalist process, right? So the Federalist Papers suggested that each state can make its own laws, and if they're going to violate the Constitution, that has to be brought up to the Constitution, and that requires an appeal process, right? You have to do the appeal process again. You have to take it to the higher court, right? You do the municipality courts first, right? You then go into larger courts, and to the point where you'd get to the state court, right? The Illinois Supreme Court, for example. If it doesn't get to the Constitution, if it doesn't get to the highest court of the land, it doesn't matter. They can't strike it down until it is,
That case is very basic, and it does go to all the states. In fact,
well, until the Federalist Papers come into play. Federalist Papers says the states can make their own laws.
Right, but they can't go against this one. And even at
they can't go against the Constitution.
That's a federal. Yeah, they
cannot go against the Constitution.
Right, but they cannot go against this ruling. So that's one
thing
they cannot.
That
I feel. But you're right. It can only be put into effect if there's a lawsuit. If somebody has to take the initiative to say we're going to sue these people, and then they will turn around and it'll have to be adjudicated. Right now, it's not.
That's the problem.
Somebody or some force or some group is telling everybody to enforce something, and nobody's fighting back.
Well, so the state you're in is either going to be woke or it's not going to be woke. If it's woke, then it's not going to reach the Constitution. It's not going to reach the highest court of the land. It's not going to reach the Supreme Court of the United States. That's the problem.
Sure.
And more than half of the states are woke. So if there are any problems in terms of what laws may be violating Marbury and Madison, it won't matter because it's not going to get to that point. You know, and that's a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing is there are good things about the Federalist Papers, and that is agency has to be applied to the individual, right? If something's going to control the individual, it has to then go to the courts of the municipalities, and then to the courts of that, and the courts of that, and the courts of that. It reduces agency as much as it possibly can to the individual, which is the purpose of the Federalist Papers. And it doesn't make one single body responsible for the decisions of a person. But there's a byproduct of that problem, and that is it takes forever for something to get to the Supreme Court. And even if it does get to the Supreme Court, of the United States, it may not even be heard. Honestly, it's up to the justices to decide whether or not the case is worth to be heard. So if there is a constitutional problem.
In other words, it's the individual, corporation, or the school. The positive thing is the Vanguard CEO has officially made a statement that all the industries that are environmental and social governance and all of that, they're not going to have anything to do with this, and they've cut their ties. And last week we were talking about two colleges that have already got fed up of all of the DEI, and they are terminating those programs. So there is progress, but you're right. They're all on an individual basis, and they are not being done through court because nobody has actually sued anybody where it could go against court.
Well, if someone does sue someone, the court may strike it down.
They can't. They can't go against the Constitution, but they are not even taking it to that because it's the board that's of each organization that is pulling this thing down.
Yes, but not in all cases is it a constitutional matter.
What'd you say?
Not in all cases is it a constitutional matter. That's why they're so good at using the linguistic word game. Is the attorneys have not mastered the postmodern neo-Marxist, you would say Lukashian, Gramscian word project. PhDs in English have mastered it, and people who have studied critical theory have mastered it, but attorneys have not. So a lot of the cases that are being heard aren't being treated properly because they don't know how to navigate in this type of ethos. And attorneys are not trained in this kind of project. What they're trained in is in law. And that's really what consumes most of their energy. So that's the other problem. And that's another reason why it's so important to master the word game. Because there are attorneys who actually believe that equity, inclusion, and diversity are legitimate terms that mean what they mean. when they're just absolutely not, and you just have to open up the box and see what's inside. They're not trained to do that, and that's the other problem. If you're going to take somebody to a court of law, the people representing you are most likely not going to have mastered the word game.
Yeah.
Any more ideas or questions?
I just want to add to the end, as a former teacher, any teacher in my area, I know without a fact, that does not use the dialogical model in learning, that does not use discourse in their classroom, is punished.
Yeah, that's so if you're perpetuating the negative dynamics, you're part of the problem. And the way not to perpetuate the negative dynamics would be to is to suggest that the student and the teacher are equals. They're not equals, but it is to suggest that they're equals. And if you're not playing that game, you're going to be either ostracized or you're going to be somehow involved in a lawsuit or,
Mm-hmm. It's shocking.
But that's not the case for people who understand.
It's shocking that a teacher would be punished for this, because it reminds me, from what I know of Mao, the Cultural Revolution. Mao Zedong, when he was doing this in China, the Communist Think movement, they had what is known as the Four Old. And those Four Old had to be eliminated. And there was old thinking, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And anyone, this is the most horrible thing, anyone that did not get rid of it was officially punished. They had a dance cap, or else they had to wear placards, and they were embarrassed and humiliated in public and punished, yes. So this thing that, I don't know the teacher who mentioned that, that's frightening that the teachers would be punished if they did not. That's terrible.
This is Tanya.
Yeah, so Maoism is interesting because Maoism is what happens when you take the full potential of that paradigm shift. When you take away when you shift the domain of Marxian analysis away from economic and class, and you instantiate it into identity and culture, what you have is actually Maoism. The only thing that's preventing Maoism in the United States is called the Constitution. But if you were able to let the reign free of reign, the philosophy is actually Maoist philosophy. It's neo-Marxism. Maoism is actually neo-Marxism. It's neo-communism. It's the communism and Marxism that came after that Lukácsian, Gramscian paradigm shift. What you see is Maoist practices in schools, cultural humiliation, and sessions of humiliation, what they call struggle sessions. If you don't admit that if you don't go along with the game, you can be called a misogynist, a racist, a bigot, an anti-transsexual, anti-trans, anti-black. If you're not playing the zero-sum fatalistic power dynamics game, where the only way to approach reality is through the master-slave dialectic, if you're not playing that game, you are part of the problem. And that's Maoist philosophy right there. So, yes, there is SEL is technically a Maoist program. It has been taken to its extreme.
More homeschooling?
The solution the solution is to master the word game and the scholars, and that's it. Because the only way people can't fight back, because they don't know how to navigate through this Marxified ethos. The only solution to this is to get people who are in office, get people who have a political or bureaucratic front, get those people educated, get those people to understand how to navigate the Marxified ethos. It's not a simple ethos to navigate through, but if the solution is to get people who have bureaucratic fronts and forces, get those people educated, get them to understand the complexities of the Marxist ethos. And it's happening, actually. It's happening slowly but surely. There are people who are in office and have some type of bureaucratic force or legislative force who are being trained in this what's called theory, and theory with a capital T. And so that's the way to fight back. Do you have any more questions?
Can people contact you, Andrushka? Can they contact you so that you can guide them when they are fighting back? Because keep in mind that the administration is being told by their bosses to endorse this. So even if they know
absolutely, yes.
they understand the terms, there's something else that's going to have to happen before it ends.
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, people can contact me.
All right. So
another way of
give
navigating.
them your email.
Yep. Are you on the? Is this a conference or video call? You can get my email over the line right now if you want live. It's as-lareau@wiu.edu. You can email me there. It all comes down really to what takes precedence, the group or the individual. And what is the way forward? Is it by means of the group or the individual? Where is the site of suffering? Is it the group or the individual? Where is the locus of responsibility? Is it the group or the individual? Every single answer you should be having is the individual. The individual is absolute and the individual is sovereign. The group is always secondary. And the entire philosophy they're pushing, the Marxist philosophy, requires you to believe at every instance of cognition that the group takes precedence over the individual. That's why things lead terribly down to horrible lanes, such as Maoism and Stalinism. Because if individuals don't matter, which they fundamentally believe because it's the very manner in which the philosophy functions, it's the very way they do business. They believe fundamentally that the individual has no sovereignty, that the locus of suffering is at the group level, that groups suffer, that the ontological status should be at the level of the group, not the individual. It is for this reason and for this reason alone that this is toxic, horrible, evil trash. If you understand this, it is very easy to navigate through society navigate through the Marxist ethos without the intricacies. Obviously, I'm going to go through the intricacies because that's extremely important as well. But it literally comes all down to what's important, what takes precedence, what is primary and what is secondary. Is it the group or is it the individual? The answer is the individual. If you want to live in a society that involves liberalism, progress, and humanity. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Any more questions about what went down in terms of positional standpoint epistemology, or scholars being actual pedophiles, or race scholars being actual race essentialists, or really any questions at all?
Thank you for the call tonight, Andrushka.
Of course. I hope that you got good information out of it, and that there's something learned at least.
Are we going to continue next Sunday, Andrushka? Do you have another session?
Oh, yes, I do, yes.
All right. Would you announce it?
It's another set, so... If you understand this, you understand the most complicated part of the course, the seizing of objective reality for positional standpoint epistemology. Because if you can seize the means by which something is considered to be knowledge, which is objective reality, then you see the means by which discourse is able to be used, language and what is true, things like that. The woke word game is to suggest that there is no objective reality except for your lived experience and your victim status. That has the highest truth value. That has the highest epistemological truth value. And so understand that, and you understand at least the most complicated part of the course. We'll get into simpler terms such as anti-racism, which is really fun and interesting. Anti-racism is basically Puritan cleansing. We'll discuss that. But simpler words are to come. But you need to understand these words, and you need to understand that these words are Marxist watchwords, and that your radar needs to be crimson red when you hear them. Obviously, your radar should be already crimson red for the lecture on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those are not pretty words. They're evil. They're wrong. But yeah, it's easier from here on out. Any more comments, concerns, questions?
This will be every Sunday at 8?
Yes, every Sunday at 7 o'clock.
Okay.
7 o'clock Central.
Thank you. 7 Central, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Narveen, are you going to update the qcinstitute.org website with the either PDFs or recordings? Because I think there's only 3 of them up there.
I do it every week, but I think this time we gave too much information, and I have to find out. I'm not sure if they updated it. I didn't get the notice, but otherwise I give them the update every week, and also give the recording. And all the recordings thus far are already updated. And the way you access the recording of the previous events is that you go into archives, then go into 2023, and then go down to the topic, and right next to the topic will be the word recording, and that's the link, and you can upload. And it's
also going to be on the YouTube. Yeah.
Yes.
You're putting it on
right,
YouTube.
And Rushka is making a YouTube, and so all the recordings are now going to also be on YouTube.
So
what's the name of that YouTube channel?
Yes.
It's
not yet completely done. Or is it, Anushka?
Okay. It technically is done. What really just needs to be done now is just the uploading of the recordings. That's it. It's the channel is called Safety Institute, I think.
QCHD.org or just QC?
What's the channel called? What's the YouTube?
Institute CHD? I don't know. What did we have it?
Okay. I will send out a link to the actual channel. If everybody who can hear me, you guys can. What I suggest you do is everybody send me an email. That way I have all of your emails, and I can just bulk send links and information and cliff notes. If everybody can hear me, my email is, again, as-lareau@wiu.edu. That way I can just bulk send in a matter of seconds, either cliff notes or what's been going down.
I'll also have it updated on your email when we do the e-flyer and upload the e-flyer. I'll have it on that also, so that's easier for everyone to have that.
Yeah, because I can post this every week too, and I know I'm reaching a few people on Facebook, etc. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
More updated that
Mike,
is, the better.
you're doing a great job with that. Thank you. And please, I ask everyone to please keep on circulating it, because this is the power that we all have.
Sorry, I got cut out. You were talking about the e-flyer and my email. I suggest that you do put my email in the e-flyer. That way, for people who came out of the call, didn't hear it, can get it. Because if I can have everybody just send me an email, I'll be able to do a bulk email sent, and all of the information will be there about what went down in the lecture, about what else needs to be learned in terms of links and citations, and maybe other people's works and references, all of it.
I really do believe that when the people are strong enough and they're alert with this and have understood what's going on, that when we band together, the administration and various organizations just have to listen. I really believe that.
Yes. Well, the good news is a little more than half America is not falling for this trash. The only problem is most of everybody don't know how to navigate it, don't know what to do about it.
Yes.
Yeah. I tell you, the state of Iowa is already voting against CRT in the public sphere, so it's a big development now in the state of Iowa.
Yep.
I think,
Michael, that's
who knows, maybe this has something a little bit to do with it.
But they will change the name CRT and then they call it something else.
Well, we'll see.
In some ways that's the case, but they're not going to. They do call it something else. The terms that they use are, social emotional learning and cultural responsive teaching. That's CRT, literally. That's all CRT, because the point of CRT in a summary is to produce Marxist activists, is to produce racial consciousness. The point of CRT is to hyper-racialize your conscience, right? Is to see race everywhere. And then if you don't see race everywhere, you're part of the problem. And if there's any type of curriculum that functions for the purpose of hyper-racializing your conscience, that's CRT. End of story. That's CRT. If the purpose is to hyper-racialize your conscience, if the purpose is to give you the lens, that when you look through the lens, you just see racial dynamics, that's CRT. So they can call it whatever they want. The project has a purpose to hyper-racialize your conscience. That's just CRT. And that's the definition of CRT, actually, according to the scholars. It's critical theory applied to race. Critical race theory is critical theory applied to race. What's critical theory? Critical theory is neo-Marxism. What's neo-Marxism? Neo-Marxism is the idea that there's a zero-sum conflict dynamics. It's a zero-sum battleground of identity groups. That's neo-Marxism. Apply that to race. So they can call it whatever they want. It's not going to be able to hide anything.
Michael, Iowa's going to have to ban CRT, but then anything that looks like CRT and smells like CRT has to be also banned.
Yes.
Yeah, that's correct. That's what they did in Tennessee. They've already made CRT illegal. However, we have CRT in our school system, and I have the superintendent on tape saying SEL is not CRT.
Okay. Yeah.
See, that's the track.
Andrew, so that's the same school district that I was talking to you about these social.
I would love to have a phone call with this man.
Well, I hope we can set that up.
Andrew,
I can get his phone number right now. We can have a 4 or 5 way call. No, that's not necessary. I can't get his phone number if I wanted to, though. I would just need his first and last name. Again, everybody needs to just email me if they can, so I can have everybody's email. I just need to have everybody's email to send them out. I both send, But yeah, if there are no more other questions.
I sent you an email just now.
Alrighty.
Tommy Weber, 83. If you could just put me on that list.
Yep, I will put you on the list. Alrighty, Chris Clark, is that?
That's not me.
Chris Clark, is that you? Are you Thomas Weber? Weber?
I am. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That's Thomas Weber. Yep. Chris Clark.
Who just spoke right there?
I'm Chris.
I'm Thomas. That's Chris.
Okay. So Thomas and Chris. Yes, I got your emails here. I will put you on the list.
Do this.
The teacher who talked about the superintendent, that's actually a very good idea. If there can be a conference call or some kind where Andrushka can talk to them directly, that may be a really good solution.
Well, Andrushka and I have been communicating back and forth, and we didn't get to a call in last week, but we're going to definitely try to do that this week before I go and speak to the school board next Thursday. I really need that.
We can do that this week.
And we will, I'll find a way for you to get a phone call in with him, even if it's a meeting between me and him and I put you on the phone while I'm in the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll figure something out.
Then he can't say he doesn't know because he will know by then.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good solution.
Absolutely.
Alrighty.
All right, I'll get this
Any more
recording
questions?
updated. What?
Yep. Oh, if there are no more questions, we shall.
Yeah, good deal. Again, thank you for your time. I appreciate you taking the time to do this and teach us all of these crazy words and lingo and terminologies. That's
Absolutely.
Whoever said it earlier. I mean, that's the problem, is the disconnect. It's hard to fight a fight if you can't even argue the words, and you can't even argue what they mean. And it steadily and repeatedly stumps me, and you can't even hold an argument because you're using the same words and they're totally different meanings. So I really appreciate it. It'll help us tremendously. So I appreciate your time, and I look forward to next Sunday.
All righty. We'll talk soon then.
All right, should I sign off then, and then everybody's going to meet next Sunday? Should I just end the recording, Andrushka?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
All right. Okay.